Hello and welcome back to a very special episode of GNAT-TV's In-Depth series. I'm Andrew McKeever, the news director here at GNAT-TV. It's a pleasure to have you with us today on Wednesday, January 31st. And it's an extremely great pleasure to be joined by a highly distinguished panel of guests here who have joined us for our conversation today. Kind of a continuation of a series of shows we've been doing for about, the past year and a half or so. We began I think it was back in the fall of 22. We did a show with a group of millennials, folks who were in their 30s basically, who were talking about what was going on in their lives and what the world seemed like to them at that point. That led to a show with a group of baby boomers who came in and talked about their perceptions of things, what they had thought the world might be like at this point, and what it actually had turned out to be. And since we had jumped over the highly critical Generation X group, I was quickly reminded that we had missed a spot here, so we had a group of Gen Xers in, had a really fun conversation, and out of that came the thought that what we should do is have a blended generations group. And before I go even further on that, I should also mention that we did, in a sort of a backwards way, have a show with some Gen Zers. Back in 2021, I had a group of then graduating seniors come in to talk about, well, the focus there was really about, what it was like going to high school during the pandemic, because these were folks who had spent roughly the first couple of years of their high school days in a sort of normal setting, and then the world got turned upside down. What was that like? However, I realized in hindsight that really we need to kind of redo that and have a group in and do it properly. So that's what's coming next. But today, it's great to have, like I said, the representation of all the age groups and generations to sort of share thinking about, what is the world looking like today? What are some of the, maybe hopes and dreams? What are some of the reflections in the past? I'm going to be wearing two hats in a way, sort of the moderator, but also here representing the baby boomers, those of us who were born between 1946 and 1965, 1965, and we also are very pleased and honored to be joined by Paige Vignola, who is here representing the X-Wingers. Paige is the assistant director for, I know I'm going to mix this up, assistant director for education, community, and community engagement at the Manchester Community Library.
That works.
Close enough? Okay. Beth Wallace is here. She's representing the millennials. She's the associate director for early childhood. She's the associate director for early childhood educator engagement with the Vermont Association for the Education of Young Children. Beth, thank you very much for making the time and coming up from Bennington to be part of the show. Also great to be joined by Keegan Douglas, who is one of my coworkers here at GNAT. He's finally getting on the right side of the camera. Usually Keegan's off in the control room making sure that we're all sounding intelligent and everything. But Keegan is a video production specialist here at GNAT, and Keegan, great to have you around the table.
Thank you, Andrew.
And last but hardly least, it's really great to welcome back to GNAT Chris Alfano, who was a student at Burton Academy. Chris was here for a show this past summer, which was about civics education, and he and his brother have developed an app called Civically, which if you haven't downloaded it yet, you really need to. It's a really great resource of information about civics and government, and really well done, Chris.
Yeah, thanks for having me back.
Well, we couldn't have done this without you. So Chris obviously is here representing the Gen Zers, and with that, I just thought it might be interesting to get us started here to kind of maybe go around the table a little bit and talk about whatever our reflections may be about our respective age groups or generational cohorts. And kind of just take it from there. I guess as I've been thinking about this show and kind of what my reflections were about the baby boomers. it's been, I guess I sort of feel like we're at once this sort of, celebrated generation for being so sizable, for one thing, but also more recently more maligned for being, I don't know. It just seems like there's a perception of like, well, we had all the fun stuff going on and kind of left the crumbs for everyone else. And I guess I was thinking about this book I remember reading back in the early 1980s called Great Expectations by an author called Landon Jones, and where and that is the book that is basically just often used as where the term baby boomers originated. He used that term in his book, and it was very. And the idea behind the Great Expectations title was that you know we there were great expectations assigned to us that we were going to go forth and do great things and change the world and make everything better. And even as early as the early 1980s, that was seeming to be a mission that was kind of not exactly happening and unfolding the way we were expecting it might have happened, like let's say 15 years earlier. Um, and I don't know. I guess I find that that whole notion kind of it captures my feeling about it fairly well. Is that uh, there was a lot of promise that seemed to be out there in the 1960s and early 1970s. Progress that we've been made around things like civil rights, sort of global peace, that the world would somehow find a way to solve some of its issues in a more peaceful fashion than going to war over stuff. And I guess I confess, as I look around the world today, I see it's just not like that at all. I mean, there were a lot of stresses, a lot of problems. We had the first Earth Day in 1970. I remember that. So it was the start of kind of the whole climate change, uh, discussion there. And here we are, what, 50 some odd years later, and we're still wrangling about climate change stuff, even when it seems like the science of it behind all that is pretty conclusive. So I don't know. I guess I sort of look back with a mix of, kind of, well, it was a pretty good ride. It was a lot of fun. Many good things happened. We had Woodstock and everything like that, and some great music back in the '60s. But there's a lot of the feast that's got left on the table somehow. But on that note, I'm going to keep quiet for a little while. I'm going to turn the microphone over to Paige here. I guess we'll go in generational order. So Beth, you'll be on deck, and then we'll go over to Keegan and finish up with Chris, and then just sort of go from there.
Goodness, I wasn't expecting that. I thought we were going around the corner. Okay, so my general reflections about my generation and the views. No, I can't speak for my generation. I can obviously only speak for myself about where I see the generation in the world, in the timeline of the world. Is that's where we're heading, I guess. Um, I tend to think, probably it's a little cliche, but I think Gen X tends to be seen as like the latchkey generation. I think that a lot of Gen Xers were grew up having to be fiercely independent, whether that is a result of multiple parents being at work at the same time, or perhaps the dissolution of a family unit. And I do add that that is not necessarily a bad thing, since women were finally allowed no-fault divorces and could get out of bad relationships. So, but I do think that Gen X tends to have that moniker of a latchkey generation. The other descriptor that I particularly am fond of is the last of the feral generations. Last generation of feral children, I think, is the way that that works, right? Because, we were, go on, go out there, go, get out the door, come back when dinner is ready, right? Which as a parent of Gen Z children, is definitely not the way the world works anymore. Um, Again, I can't speak for my generation. I can speak for myself, where I can say that throughout my life, I have been striving towards more optimism, but I feel that generationally speaking, my peers tend to be less optimistic about the world than what you described earlier. Whether it's because, again, I'm a late Gen Xer, so I was a 70s child, not a 60s child. And I think that a number of us grew up watching the dissolution of social safety nets through the 80s and 90s, and that definitely puts us as children, looking at how society cares less and less for people, that maybe tends to make us a little bit more pessimistic. I'm also of the generation where, I mean, I was a neo-punk industrial grunge kid, so I mean, like, that was like, fly in the face of, whatever the establishment says, forget it, it's got to be wrong, right? I don't know if that, kind of comes across in my physical appearance at all, but
It does.
yeah, okay, but it's a little subtle. I appreciate that. But again, I don't want to speak for my generation and say that all of us are pessimistic. I think that a number of advancements became fundamental to the aging process of X-wingers, and I am going to say X-wingers, largely because, I mean, you take a look at, and this is one of my favorite topics, genres of literature that are, I think, closely tied to the generations. I find sci-fi fantasy tends to be one that I automatically associate with X-wingers or Generation X. If you think about, the first steps onto, off the planet and onto the moon, that's the beginning of this generation, right? I mean, the development and throughout our entire lives, watching, space shuttles, gathering in classrooms in order to be able to watch, sometimes with disastrous results, the International Space Station, and this sort of thing was exceptional, and then also tied into the idea of the Cold War that we all grew up with. So you have this exceptional advancement and then this incredible fear that sort of is overlying, I think, a lot of that. So I think that, I mean, it's kind of a mixed bag. I mean, I think every generation is kind of a mixed bag, but I think that there's, that maybe leads to why Gen Xers tend to be seen as sort of the middle child and just sort of skipped over, because it's not tremendous. You don't have the peace movements of the 60s that are part of this generation, right? You don't have the climate activists that are part of the millennial and Gen Z generation that is, immediate to Gen X. I'm going to pause there. And I'm sure I'll jump in on other ideas, but I'm going to pause there for my general overview.
Well, Beth, over to you.
So a couple of things you just said. Paige brought up some images and like pop culture touch points for me. So my favorite cartoons, and I think I was saying this in an icebreaker at work the other day. My favorite cartoons when I was a kid were David the Gnome, which originated in Switzerland, and it was like these gnomes, and I went back when my daughter was born and watched the very first episode, and it was all talking about how like the adults had polluted the world, and the gnomes and the children were innocent in this, and the gnomes and the forest animals were it was heavy stuff. And then my second favorite cartoon was Captain Planet, where there was like earth and wind and I don't know who else, but Captain Planet was green and our powers combined, and he was like fighting the manufacturers, and so I think that maybe that was the very beginning, right? Post the X-wingers of starting to talk about climate change, but certainly not in a big way. And I guess I think just kind of about all of the things that millennials experienced. And we talked a little bit earlier about, mistrust in institutions and connecting that to climate change. We had a lot of greenwashing. We thought if we just recycled, that was it. We're going to save the planet.
Because your straw makes all the difference.
Right. Right. And now we're still learning about, how much of our recycling actually goes into the ocean, and that's not, the one simple thing that we can do to, embrace the inner Captain Planet. And we had 9/11, and we had, the Great Recession. So when I graduated college, there were not as many jobs as I was promised when I was told that I had to have a 4-year degree to do anything with my life, right? So there was that too. Student loan debt has kind of defined the millennial generation. It's crazy to me that you have to be 21 to, smoke cannabis or drink alcohol, but at 18 you can sign on for hundreds of $1,000s of debt. And the other thing that you were talking about with being the latchkey generation is now as a parent, I read books like free range parenting, like how to go back to that, right, and give your kids some autonomy. But I think perhaps the defining difference is and I don't know if this is just me or my whole generation. I think there are more of me, but we're still optimistic, and so I don't know what the difference was there. Maybe it's just we haven't had as long, you know. We're still developing that futuristic. What do we think is going to happen? But despite all of those pieces, still remain optimistic.
All right. Keegan.
My turn. So I was born in June 1998, so I'm on the cusp between millennials and Gen Z. So basically, I was old enough to use MySpace, but young enough to use TikTok in a real way. But so there's a philosopher named Fukuyama, who I can't remember his first name. He's a conservative philosopher, and he said after the Cold War, at the fall of the Soviet Union, that history had ended. And I think this is a sentiment that sort of carries into my generation. We all feel sort of like we can't do anything. The generational term, and my peers might know this term, is black-pilled. We feel like there's no hope anymore. But our history is still being written. A lot of us are politically minded. A lot of us go to protests. So I'm hoping that we can pull ourselves out of it. But right now it looks quite bleak. Student loan debt, as you mentioned, is absolutely insane. Rent prices, like I graduated into COVID from college. So there were no jobs. And then the jobs that I would have taken were taken by younger people when the jobs came back. I don't know, it feels a little bleak sometimes, but I'm just hoping we can get ourselves out of that mindset.
Yeah, I would say I think you summed up our generation pretty well. I'm a few years younger than you. I'm 18. Our generation, it's really sort of still coming into its own, I'd say. So there definitely is, that outlook that things are bleak. But I do think that, as a high schooler, some of my peers, there's still a lot of optimism permeating throughout our generation. But like you said, a lot of concern and a lot of, attunement to different social, political issues, but not really an idea of what we can do about it. So yeah, definitely in that respect, I'd say there's a bit of helplessness, a bit of hopelessness, but I remain optimistic like Keegan that hopefully we can pull ourselves out of it so that we don't look back on our generation 50 years from now and say we had all these concerns and we weren't able to address them. So
I have to say, as a consummate pessimist who's fighting to become an optimist, I look at your generation in particular. So I've got Gen Z kids, and that gives me hope, right? Because I look at a generation of kids who are aware of what's going on around them. And I don't mean to insult you by calling you a kid, so I do apologize. I look at a generation of young people who are more interested in learning about what's going on around them, right? When my generation was young, most of us didn't. We may have had to sit and watch the news, but we weren't really interested in paying attention to what was going on in the news, not for the sake of making a difference. I look at the 17, 18, 19, 20-year-olds that I know, and they're all interested in what's happening because, well, what can I do about it? And so seeing that fills me with hope because, I mean, as you all are getting to the point where you will start taking over the everyday functioning of the world, and the fact that you care enough to try to figure out how to fix things. That's where finally
Yeah.
somebody.
we're definitely a curious generation. I think a lot of my peers think a lot about the world around them. We had our annual review at GNAT last night, and I was thinking about media and how much us Gen Z people, we were sort of shoved down our throats products by big corporations our whole life, media products and actual physical products. And I think a lot of us are kind of getting tired of that and tired of our lives being directed by people we don't even know anymore, people we don't know at all. And I think we're hoping, I don't know, I see changes coming, but I'm not certain how it's going to happen, but we'll see what happens, right? Maybe it'll be like the boomers where we do a bunch of protests and then nothing happens. But
Well, something happened.
Something happened. Yeah, that's true.
Well, and I know, Andrew, you say you feel like your generation is attacked, right? So I'm not trying to make this as an attack on your generation, but what I do see is boomers not willing to relinquish control, right? So, I mean, when you look
That's fair.
at government, right? When
Yeah.
you look at, I mean, presidential process, senatorial elections, any of that sort of stuff, move over. I mean, whether it's going to be a Gen Xer or an X-winger who is going to be trying to step up, it seems more likely to be a millennial who's going to be trying to step up and make a difference. But I just feel like our society has become fairly calcified, and I don't know, maybe that is a conservative turn, right? I mean, like, because I know, conservative, you conserve the status quo, but I mean, time does march on, whether one wants to call it progress or not. Time does march on, and it is necessary for younger generations to be able to step up and fill those roles.
It'd be interesting to kind of go back and look at whether or not, let's say 100 years ago, the makeup of Congress generationally was roughly the same as it is now. I mean, I suppose might be slightly longer life expectancies now in place, but if relative to all of that, they basically were run by 70 or 80-year-old people that whose best days were somewhat in the past, and we're just having a hard time relinquishing control. I mean, I totally agree with you. I mean, I think it does come to a point where, yeah, I mean, and of course the presidential election this year, or the likely presidential election, the classic example of that. Why we don't have two candidates who are 15 to 20 years younger in the running is a mystery to me. Whether or not that's a sort of a one-off, unusual situation or a pattern, I don't know. But you're correct. I mean, I think, yeah, absolutely. The world is a different place than it was in 1969, 1970. And, I know I hearken back to like, oh, well, I remember when we used to do things like this. And I feel like, okay, so my response to that is, I don't want to deal with it. But anyway, again, I want to be careful to qualify, to echo something you said, that, I'm speaking for myself and what my sense is of stuff, but no generation is monolithic. Mm-hmm. I mean, one of the things I feel a lot of people look at baby boomers and think, oh, okay, they were the people who went out in anti-war demonstrations and did this and did that. Well, some of us did. And then probably the majority of us were just sort of trying to live lives kind of like what their parents were like, get a job, go to work, make a living, buy a house, have a family, and retire when you're 65.
Which was still possible in your generation.
Right, although it seems to be slipping away. But anyway, yeah, I mean, that's another great question, too. Perhaps we could explore.
I think the boomers get a lot of hate sometimes, especially by people my age, and unnecessary hate. Or not hate, but just people are overly critical towards boomers because it's not individual people of the boomer generation who created climate change or whatever. I mean, the writing had been on the wall since the 50s. I don't know. I think the pessimism of Gen X, millennials, and Gen Zers, we forget to look at how much stuff went on during the boomer era. Like we didn't have to live through a Vietnam, for example. You kind of did. You were like a little tiny baby though, but but like Andrew actually had to worry about getting drafted, and we didn't have anything like that. And like one thing I hear a lot is that Gen Zers grew up, with a war always happening, but so the boomers did too. Like there's pretty much always some sort of war happening. I don't know. It's just we all had our problems. Each generation has their problems.
Well, I'm struck by how your generation, the more I study about it, the more I realize how big of a deal things like 9/11 and the Great Recession of 08, 09 have had long-lasting impacts, particularly the Great Recession, particularly in terms of politics, how it's shaped our politics today. And I guess one of the things I'll just say, because I just feel like it's important to get it out there, is that one of the things I find most sad about the world today is is the political division and polarization that goes on in this country now. I mean, and I think back, well, it was like that in the 60s too, wasn't it? I mean, you had the same kind of division between people who were supportive of the government and felt we should, stay in Vietnam until we've won, and versus those who felt that the whole thing was stupid and ridiculous. And as John Kerry put it, who wants to be the last one to die for a mistake? Um, and yet, I guess and maybe it was just because I was a lot younger then. I always felt like, well, eventually, this eventually will be over, and we'll kind of get back to normal again, or those wounds will be healed. And I guess I look at some of the divisions that are happening now, and I just don't see how that healing process works in a relatively short amount of time. I don't know. Maybe I'm just sort of being overly pessimistic, but it feels like there are some divisions that go so culturally deep that it'll be a while. It won't be just once the presidential election this fall is over, we'll kind of go back to, life as usual.
It feels like we're in a period in our country of being more introspective versus, thinking about world wars I mean that, understanding that we're also thinking about Israel and Palestine and world conflicts, but that we're kind of coming to terms with institutionalized racism. And that did not sound like, part of the conversation before how long ago, in the way that it is now. And we're talking about, the divisions that are happening within our borders. We're talking about immigration, these like really massive, complex issues that you can't solve a complex problem with a simple solution, right? But it feels like, amidst all of these really big topics and things that we need to dig into and things that we need to think about how to come to terms with and how to repair. We also have social media, which is developing echo chambers and is so divisive. There only ever seems to be two sides to something, right? Like everything is black and white. And society and human beings are too complex to be black and white. That's what I struggle with.
I don't know if you've noticed this, but I definitely feel like our generation is very black and white about morals. Like,
Absolutely.
just depending on whatever side you're on, like everyone's like, this is the right way, and a lot of that has to do with the conditioning that we were brought up with social media, the quick, like I said, I grew up with more early internet stuff, but still it affects me in the same way where I'm very black and white about my morals. Sorry, everyone, but
Yeah, like to your point about echo chambers, I think that's the double-edged sword really of all this technology and media that my generation has never lived without. On one hand, we do have access to so much information we can learn about these different issues, like you were saying earlier. But on the other hand, certain platforms, especially like Instagram, Facebook, TikTok, literally have algorithms designed to show you what will confirm what you already believe. And that just, contributes to that stark contrast, that black and white. That's really hurtful, and it's gonna become more and more detrimental to our country and our society as we move forward.
And there's no vetting of information. I mean, on any of those platforms. Years ago, I was a high school teacher, and one of the things that I used to point out all the time to my students who wanted to use Wikipedia as a source, it's like, okay, that's great. It is, however, an open source repository for information. So I could write a Wikipedia entry on goat herding. That doesn't mean that I know anything about goat herding, right? I mean, and I feel like we've only sort of evolved more in that direction where anybody can pretend to be an expert on any subject. You put it out there on social media, or you put it out there, you got on your website or your videos that your reels that you're putting out, and well, it's out there. They're saying it, and they're saying it a lot, so it must be true. I just want to circle back to something that you said, Andrew, where you said that you feel that right now politics is perhaps getting more and more polarized, and it's impossible to come to any kind of compromise. Perhaps maybe I'm extending what you said in a way that you didn't actually intend. But I also think to myself, I'm pretty sure that polarization has existed in every single generation of American history. And as you were saying that, I thought to myself, well, sure, but nobody was nearly beaten to death on the Senate floor by a cane, which of course we know happened, what, in 1860s, right? So, I mean, like that hatred, I think, has existed among politicians for opposing viewpoints with varying degrees of severity. So I don't know that we are more polarized now than we were, or is it more we're just able to see that a lot more and more people have a voice to kind of jump behind the yeah snowflake or whatever it is that you're getting at, you know what I mean, like, so that it's just that it's louder perhaps than it was before.
It does feel like, when you talk about that, yeah, snowflake and being able to kind of hurl insults, it feels like discourse um, has fallen apart, really. Maybe there was that same passion and that hatred, but and I'll just like go off on a little tangent about Vermont and town meeting day. So I was thinking on the drive here, about this is a show about our generations, but also within context, right? So I grew up in Vermont, and I knew we would talk a little bit about politics, and I was thinking about the presidential election, and currently I'm more focused on local politics and state politics because it feels like, because of everything that you've said, that's where you can have the most impact. And actually, so I belong to Shire's Young Professionals. I'm on the board, and in February we have coming up an introduction to like town meeting day, especially for folks who are new to Vermont, because town meeting day is kind of a unique thing. And I grew up going to town meeting every March. It's like my favorite holiday. We would all,
Me too.
and it got really passionate. I mean, I remember my neighbors raising their voices, and there were really heated debates. And at that time, you voted on the floor, like in your elementary school gymnasium, right? Like you voted on whether to fund the local library or something else. But I think what makes it so important and such a Vermont institution, that we need to protect is you couldn't hide behind a screen, right? You couldn't anonymously post to some forum and call your neighbor names. Everybody who showed up was there because whether they agreed with you or not, they were invested in the community. And you all had to see each other at the post office the next week. So, it sounded different.
Well, there has to be some element of civility that way.
Right, right. You're accountable for those actions. And I think, social media and just kind of how people have been emboldened to use derogatory terms, to not think before they speak, is a real disappointment.
What do you all think about artificial intelligence? I've been thinking a lot about that lately and feeling grateful that I'm going to age out of all of that, so I won't really have to deal with it the way you guys will. But I don't know. I mean,
Well, Skynet's due to overthrow the world any minute now, right?
Yep.
I mean, it seems like a fascinating combination of stuff that be a way to solve a lot of problems and make things a lot easier to do. But at the same time, there's a gigantic dark side to the whole thing where, like you were saying, with the internet, the deep fake stuff and how you can, put in some politician's voice in and have them saying something that they didn't really say. I mean, I just find that crazy.
But that's not the technology, that's the user.
Yeah.
Right. I mean, like the technology in and of itself isn't necessarily problematic. It's how it is used. And I mean, I know that questions of regulation are always touchy subjects, but I mean, I think there are incredibly deep and powerful uses for AI technology in medical fields, right? I mean, like, and scientific evaluation, right? I mean, all that computer brains can clearly do a lot more, a lot faster than humans can. You talk about deep fakes, right? I mean, that's again, that's a user error. That's not the technology in and of itself.
So I work at a media facility, as we know. So I have a lot of opinions on AI. I don't like AI. I think we're not ready for it. I think AI and just generally the way technology is moving, we're going to see a lot more of our jobs being automized is the word. But we don't have any safety nets like as workers. So I see like AI right now can't edit a video in the same way I can, or shoot a video in the same way I can, or whatever. But in like a year or so, it probably can. And then when industries decide that they don't need human beings doing it anymore because a computer can do it, then what am I going to do? Because there's no social safety nets. Those got all overturned when Andrew was a kid. Um,
Thanks, Keegan.
so that freaks me out. I think it says something really sort of dark about our priorities as a culture and a society, that we prioritize the innovation of technology, consumer technology, over the protections of actual human beings. Um, yeah. I just want to ride a train instead of driving a car, really. That's really what I want.
I'd say as a student, I think the intersection between AI and academia in particular is really interesting. Last year, I remember when ChatGPT, which is probably the most popular free AI chatbot that you can download on your phone, it released, and just immediately the school and the teachers and the students had to decide, what's the role of this, and no one was really prepared to answer that question. What is the role of this technology in a school setting? And I had conversations with teachers who were like, you know, on one hand, this is incredible. I can ask it this question. It can give me so much information about history or science and whatnot. But on the other hand, it really threatens to eliminate every student's just ability to think on their own and think critically, because they think, oh, I can just rely on this AI chatbot. And I think that's really, AI, everyone calls it an innovation, but ironically, it's going to actually stifle innovation, because if people can't, think for themselves and think creatively on the fly, I think that's going to be really, really harmful.
Yeah, it'll be interesting to see how it all plays out. I mean, there's definitely the potential for that. I remember the first time I heard about ChatGPT, I thought, wow, why wasn't that around when I was in college? I could have, banged out all the term papers they wanted, without losing a night's sleep. But
I mean, just putting it out there, I mean, you can avoid all that just by making people do oral examinations or handwritten examinations, and then ChatGPT can't help you.
Yeah.
I mean, so I think that there is here. See, look, I'm trying to be optimistic, right? So I think that there is the potential for sort of allowing us to revert back to older forms of education that do, again, oral examinations require a lot more from you. Right? I mean, not only do you have to have your information, you have to have your ability to communicate your information. You have to have your ability to think on your feet and be able to respond to questions and stimulus and whatnot. So, I mean, I think that perhaps AI might force schools to, or educational processes to move in a different direction. And I don't necessarily think that's a bad thing, because for years, and now mind you, when I was teaching, ChatGPT wasn't an issue, but it used to drive me crazy that I would have students who literally could not write out complete sentences. And I mean literally, literally, not literally figuratively, could not write out complete sentences because they had gotten so accustomed to grammar checkers or spell checkers. And if you asked them to write anything by hand, they couldn't spell the simplest words because that wasn't something that they needed to do. Now, again, maybe I'm old fashioned in that regard. I kind of still like the spelling bee as a contest, and I know that makes me old. Not okay, boomer old, but that does make me old. But I think that having the need to move away from technology in certain areas of education will help develop um, cognitive skills that have sort of fallen dormant.
That freaks me out, the idea of written exams, because I'm dyslexic, but I love writing essays. I really like that in when I went to college. But like I really actually valued the spell checkers and stuff,
Mhm.
because I would just like make a mistake and I totally wouldn't notice, or I'd put the word this twice or whatever, and not see it because my brain can't see it. So,
Mhm.
in some ways, I was down about AI and technology, but it does, where the way education is structured, will exclude people with disabilities like that.
Mm.
Fortunately, mine's not that bad, but like um, those tools will help uh, assist
Mhm.
people.
Hmm.
So go back to user error then.
Yeah, go back to user area.
The technology in and of itself isn't bad. How is it being implemented?
That's true because human beings have to use the AI
Mm-hmm.
technology to make the deep fakes. They don't just make themselves
Mhm.
yet.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Just to build on one point you were making there, Keegan, you mentioned that one of the concerns would be that this will eliminate lots of jobs. I mean, I remember hearing that same thing back when I was a kid. Yet automation was going to come in, and I remember listening to my father talking about this, how there was going to be some machine that was going to put him out of work and everything like that. It didn't happen that way, but I guess my feeling is there's always going to be somebody who's going to need to do something to program the robot or whatever
Yeah.
the tool is that's going to be around. When you look back at the history of industrialization, going back to the 17 or 1800s or whatever, you know, machines replaced human labor, but more jobs were created somehow or another. I don't know. That's been the pattern.
Just different jobs and new jobs
Yeah.
in order to be able to accommodate.
But whether or not that continues, of course.
And that, well, I mean, that's great. That's great if that happens. But I think my point was more that your dad was worrying about lack of jobs, which is still a problem. The fact that lack of jobs is still a fear that we all have, like an innate the knife of poverty is always there. And I think we should be past that a little bit, where if I lost my job here, for example, and I couldn't afford my rent, I shouldn't like have to be on the street or whatever.
Well, and I think the knife of poverty has gotten sharper.
It has gotten
again,
sharper.
if you consider the fact that a college tuition in 1990 um, is probably, I'm just gonna say what, a third, a quarter of what a college tuition is now. And I understand inflation and all the rest of that sort of stuff, but it in your generation, as you started off describing, it was possible to go out and get a job and get a decent job and buy a house and have a family. And I saw, pardon me with the social media, but I saw a post on Instagram this morning that was kind of outlining as like, oh, a 25-year-old who is making $100,000 a year is going to be spending 800 and some odd dollars on rent, 615 donations to charitable organizations, $40 on a phone. Are you kidding me? Like, who is this 25-year-old
Yeah.
and what universe are they living in that they're spending $800 on rent and giving $600 to charities like that? What? I mean, so it just the knife of poverty getting sharper. Who can afford I don't know, say a one-bedroom apartment on a single individual's paycheck these days? It's and once you've, or if you've got the rent that you have to pay, how are you gonna pay for utilities? How are you gonna pay for car insurance if you live somewhere that does not have transportation services, or gas money, or groceries, or I don't know, maybe you want to go see a movie every now and then, or maybe you want to, okay, nobody does that anymore, but like you want to sign up for a streaming service, right? I mean, like, so it's a real concern that I think has gotten more and more intense. Your father may have been concerned about losing his job due to mechanization in the workplace, but Keegan's concerned about if he loses his job, he may starve to death, right? I mean, like, that's it has not gone away, and I think it has gotten more severe.
Guys, I paid $5 for Sour Patch Kids yesterday. Just a pack of Sour Patch Kids.
Crazy.
$5. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's gosh, there's so many thoughts. You know, thinking back to college and the cost of it and everything, I remember when I went to UVM, tuition was like $2,000 a year,
Oh my
and
God. I
I
went to UVM too, and it was not that.
I had some money saved. I had part-time jobs. I worked in the summer, and I graduated from college with no debt. And it wasn't really very hard to, college loan debt was simply not an issue then, and I hear about it constantly now, and I think that that's a really that's part of that whole economic sharp knife. I mean, clearly when you're having to come up with, I mean, 20, 30, $40,000 a year to just retire in debt. I mean, that means you're not buying the house, or you're not buying a washing machine, or doing other things that would stimulate the economy. And I find that whole issue around college loan debt very troubling. I mean, my own kids are struggling with it, and I think it really calls into question, what is the future of college? What is again, back when I was leaving high school, going to college was like what you did if you qualified. I mean, that was the way you were gonna move up economically in the world. If you wanted to get a better paying job, you had to have a college education. And but if it gets to the point where the cost benefit ratio is so skewed, um, and I think for me anyway, the most valuable part of college was really the social aspect
Mm.
and learning to meeting other people from different parts of the country and getting exposed to a lot of diversity. The classroom stuff was great and that was useful, but it was really the experience, the overall. And I think we get to a point where college becomes too expensive, and people decide to, I can live without, paying $40,000 a year for 20 years. Um, that will profoundly change, I think, our country for sure.
I know that when I graduated college, so I went to Wheaton College in Massachusetts. You know, it's an okay private school, um, and my loan debt is significant. Uh, and I made that decision when I was 17. I didn't know what I was doing. I almost went to NYU, but I didn't. So thank God. Um, but my first job out of college, and this is again going back to COVID. There were no video jobs. Was in behavioral health. It was a job I could have gotten just with a high school degree, and I was like, oh my God, what am I doing? I'm gonna be stuck in. Why did I even go to college? Like, there's no point. And I was at that job for maybe 2 years. So, yeah, college is seeming less and less, practical as time goes on. But then again, if you don't have a college degree, you don't have a chance to get a professional job. But then again, can you even pay for your loan debt with that professional job? I don't know.
I'm a huge advocate for trade schools, right? Just like flat out, because I feel like that is something that people had been sort of steered away from for a long period of time. And I mean, obviously, we need more tradespeople in the world. That is quite apparent if you try and call, say, a plumber or an electrician, right? But I also think the point that you're making, right? I mean, if you go to apply for a professional job, yeah, you need to have a college degree, preferably have some kind of higher education degree. Plus, your internship is going to require you have 5 years experience. I mean, like so, like there's this huge dichotomy of like what reality demands versus what is practical. So,
And also, we have a shortage in the workforce,
mhm,
especially in Vermont. But I think about, student debt is student loan debt is one piece of the puzzle, and then it just stacks from there,
mhm,
right? So, God forbid you want to buy a house
mhm,
after,
mhm,
within 15 years
With a
of
white picket fence.
graduating, right? And you somehow find something locally, which is hard. And those prices have gone up. And then you have a child or two. The cost of childcare, rightfully so, because I'm in that industry and the cost of childcare is not comparable to the cost of providing childcare. But those three things combined, like I lived that.
mhm.
And it's just impractical to have we still have the ideal of what success or what the American dream looks like, right? Of this ideal future, but it's just not achievable, and especially not for folks who don't have a safety net in the form
Mhm.
of family, right? If you're already starting with, few supports, if you don't have family that can help you, help maybe offset your rent when you first graduate or something like that.
And then you get into a car accident, you have to go to the hospital.
Right, right. Insurance, like if you have insurance,
Mhm.
lucky you, and you're paying out the nose for that too.
So we have about 4 or 5 minutes left, and I'd just like to think the great way to wind up is to build on the point you just mentioned there, Beth. The whole idea of the future of the American dream, for lack of a better term. I mean, again, thinking back to my day, that was like kind of unquestioned. I mean, the only thing you had to do was work hard and play by the rules, and you would get ahead. It would happen if you did your bit. The rest of society would cooperate. But I guess, how do we all feel about that? I mean, is that something that is a kind of feels like it's slipping away, or is it still there and you just have to, just sort of, have to take a different approach to it, or what's our feeling about that?
I do not feel like the American dream is attainable anymore. I think I know a lot of people, and this is anecdotal, but a lot of people I talk to are not, interested in buying a house, are not interested in having kids. I maybe have met one person who is interested in doing those things, who's my age. Um, but for me, it's like uh, everyone's sort of defining what their own sort of dream is now. For me, it's like everyone to leave me alone and let me have fun, and for me to be able to afford rent. But other than that, I'm not gonna have kids. I'm not gonna have a house. I just don't think that's possible. So I don't know. That's my opinion. What do you think?
Yeah, I'm still in school, so I can't really give a judgment on if the American dream is attainable. I can tell you that people definitely still believe in it, though. I still hear often, again, anecdotal, but people talking about, starting businesses and getting jobs and, starting families and living in these grand houses. So I guess I'll find out in the next couple of years if, maybe I'll wind up like Keegan, where I think, that's no longer possible the way it was for my parents and grandparents. But you never know. Maybe things can turn around, and by the time I'm
We
30,
don't want to discourage you from that.
Yeah, sorry.
I think that, not to quote, early 2000s music, but where it is usually depends on where you start, right? So, I mean, I think that the American dream is completely attainable for people who have a cushion to begin with. I think that if, this concept of bootstraps, pulling yourself out of nothing, is far less attainable. I'm not going to say it's impossible because nothing's impossible, right? Well, almost nothing is impossible, but it is far less likely to be something that a person can achieve because of debt from going to school, or the inability for a minimum wage job to be able to support anybody in anything, or again, health insurance costs or hospital costs. So I mean, like, I think all of these things make it less likely that one is capable of building from nothing. Right. So again, if you start off in a very happy position, the chances are you're going to be able to build on that and build into a happy position. Um, I do want to comment on one thing, which is, when we started this whole conversation, I believe you said you were an optimist, and I'm noticing that we've kind of veered from there. So I don't know if I'm a little pleased by that, or a little. I'm sorry.
I was thinking the same. Given all of that, I think there's got to be a breaking point. And I don't know whether that's coming in the next 5 years or 10 years or 20 years, but it's not sustainable, right? And I think the more and more people who realize that that dream is not attainable, is not achievable, um, there has to be change. And so I'm optimistic that there will be change. I don't know what that looks like yet. I think my hope is that, given the context of like social media, and we didn't really dive into what that means for the individual user, but um, it feels like people are a lot more isolated now. And I think it feels to me, I would be interested to hear what you all think, but it feels like depression, anxiety rates have risen. Maybe we're just talking about them more now than we used to. Um, to me, and all of the economic pressures and political pressures, it just feels like people are suffering. And I think my hope is that we figure out how to connect to each other, and how to depend on each other. Maybe again, maybe that's something that sounds familiar to you, because when I think about your generation, that's kind of what I idealize. But I think that plays a role in how this all changes, is that we're not all out for number one and focused on our individual circumstance, but that we have to kind of look outside of ourselves and look out for each other.
Yeah, you're absolutely correct. We do, and then I keep going back. One of the things we didn't get a chance to talk about too much is the music and art of the time, and I go back to some of the lyrics of some of the music I remember listening to. And that notion of helping other people out and kind of being there for other people, that was a prominent part of like a lot of the lyric stuff. And I like to think that that's a universal constant. It'll never go away, despite.
I don't know. I look around me and I think that's absolutely not a universal constant. One of the a conversation that I have had with my older brother a variety of times is that the difference between maybe being more to the right of the political spectrum versus being more to the left of the political spectrum is where you see the sphere of your moral responsibility at. Right, and like if your moral responsibility at that sphere is in your nuclear family versus your community versus fellow human beings, right? I mean, and I look around me, and again, the inner pessimist keeps rearing its head. I see fewer and fewer people who actually care about others around them, and it's more the, well, what's in it for me?
Late capitalism.
I think we need a part two of the show.
Yeah.
Yeah.
We're just scratching the
going.
surface here. But we're going to have to leave it there for today anyway. But maybe have to have you all back again in a month or two. And
I work here.
right, yeah, you're not going anywhere.
And I'm here all the time anyway.
AI won't come in that quickly, so that you'll still be here.
Yeah.
But yeah, I guess we're going to have to run. But thank you all very much. This has really been fun and really interesting, thought-provoking conversation. And it's interesting to kind of reflect back and compare and kind of ponder what may lie ahead. Anyway, so Keegan Douglas, Chris Alfano, Paige Vignola, Beth Wallace, thank you all very much for being with us, and thanks to all of you who've been with us as well. Hope you found the show interesting and thought-provoking, perhaps. And well, we may be back. You never know. And meanwhile, thank you for sharing part of your day with us.